Okay. Hi. So, um, so where are we right now? So right now we've gotten to the point where last week was all of the alpha releases, and because of that, we're at a point where you've now had a chance to show your game and had people take a look at it, and as of yesterday, had people play it. And playtesting is powerful because it helps you understand what people actually like, what regular people are going to think when they play your game. And so even after yesterday, you're probably looking at your game and saying, okay, there's things that I want to look at, there's things that I want to fix. So what are we going to work on now? Right? This is the main thing that we're trying to get at. And because this is the topic of ludology, the idea is that we're just trying to find ways of making your game more fun, right? It's already good because we've managed to go through like some tech demos, we've managed to do some, proof of concept stuff, and you know that your game at least has a potential to be fun. Otherwise, we wouldn't have picked it. But now we just need to figure out what it is you're going to do. Anyway, so and based on the chat that we've had so far about what results you saw or what things you observed from your playtest, really there's three main things that we get people to focus on at this stage. And again, this is all in the service of trying to make your game more fun. But at least now we're past the point where we're going to come up with ideas that are fun, or thinking about mechanics that would be fun. Your game is what it is right now. All we can do is try to bring it out more. And most of the things that we would suggest at this point fall under three major categories. So communication, challenge, and aesthetics, in that order. Because you need to be able to establish one before you can move on to the next one, right? And we saw this a little bit. People were talking about how their game, like people didn't quite know what they were supposed to do, or they didn't know about, like the upgrade system, or like certain things weren't clear. And so people who were playing your game kind of missed out on certain key aspects of it. So that's why we're going to start off with communication. Because if there's anything that people find from their playtesting, it's that their game isn't necessarily communicating to the player what it is that they're supposed to do, right? And that's what games are supposed to do constantly, right? These things are interactive. It's interactive media, which means that, yeah, there's going to be a back and forth between the things that you make and the player. But because of that, there needs to be communication going, so that every time the player is meant to do something, your game communicates what it is that they're meant to do. This is where we throw in a big caveat: not through text. This is one of the things that is generally understood, but also something that I was finding in the research I did for my PhD, that text-based communication is not going to work. And I know it's easy, right? You can put up a dialog box at the beginning that says, here are your controls. You do WASD to move, space to shoot, this button to jump, this button to go. But no one's really going to absorb all that, not when they're eager to go in straight into your game and play it. You should always assume that people are never going to read anything that you put up, so that any communication you do has to be through other kinds of means. Okay, so if you acknowledge that and you accept that, then you have to ask yourself, what is it that you're trying to communicate? What is it that your game still needs help in communicating? It always falls under, again, a few basic categories. One, what is the player supposed to do, right? I mean, to some extent, you can convey some of that at the beginning, and they'll start wandering around, and there's a certain natural behavior that players are going to have. But if there's something specific you want them to do, some experience you want them to have, then typically one of the problems that people encounter after playtesting is that the player's just not getting what it is that they're meant to do or where they're supposed to go. So this is usually based on things like, what is the goal of the level? What kind of things you need to do in order to be able to accomplish this higher goal? What is the reason why you're doing all this stuff? All this needs to be communicated. Then there's the idea of, once you do have the goal, like what the player's supposed to do, being able to communicate how they're meant to do it, right? You can say what the overall goal is. I need to escape this room, and the sub goals are like, I need to pick up these pieces to be able to form this picture so I can get out of the room. But then you have to say, okay, well, how do I go and find these things? Like, what are the little obstacles, little tasks that you're meant to accomplish in order to be able to achieve these sub goals? And communicating to the player what's like what their controls are, what actions they can do, and then based on those actions, how are they supposed to put them together in order to create some sort of strategy, right? The last one is particularly hard. That one is almost like you have to just, give them the tools and then walk away and then hope that they can figure it out. The last thing is communicating when things are going well, and if they're not going well, communicating kind of how the player could do better to be able to accomplish the goals you've set out. All right. This usually takes the form of things like rewards and feedback, to be able to tell them, yes, you're going the right way, or, really you should turn around now, right? Because the thing you're trying to do is in the opposite direction. So I'm saying all these things, but the typical reaction that we get when we talk about these things is like, well, I think I'm doing pretty well. And while some people, like, yeah, you go into this game feeling like, oh, I think I've communicated what needs to happen. Like, I've put these things around my level. I've told them at the beginning what happens. Your playtesters are going to be the ones who ultimately determine whether your game is a good communicator or not. And so this is why we made you playtest yesterday. And once you've gotten the feedback from there, like the first thing you should do is make sure that anything that's getting in the way of people understanding your game has to be ironed out. It's tempting to think, because you're so familiar with this game, that it's obvious what it is that people are supposed to do. But again, like, this thing like the back of your hand, right? So you just jump straight into the main gameplay loop that your game is supposed to be about, without thinking about how it's perceived by someone for the first time. And again, this is why we get you batches of completely fresh playtesters who have never seen your game to be able to say, first impressions, here's how I think I should go about it. And why we tell you to ask them to think aloud, so that you can hear their thought process and realize what it is that they actually see in your level compared to what you think they should see. And so what we need to do is we need to be able to give you some tools to help you solve some of the problems you're encountering right now. People are not going to know, like, there's this object that they need to go pick up, right? Like, say you're in a dark room and there's a monster chasing you and you need to pick up these things in order to be able to escape the room. You need to be able to communicate to the player where those things are. If you've got something where, there's a particular task or like a particular action that they can take, but they're not doing it, how do you try to communicate to them that this is a good time for them to, press the level up button or, whatever. So let's talk about some of these things. Like we said, there's three major things that your game's going to want to work on at this point. First is being better at communicating what the player needs to do. This is where we try to revisit level design, because when we talked about level design, we said that level design versus character design is all about laying out the environment and putting together the challenge so that the player knows what it is that they're meant to overcome. So if you're finding that it's difficult for people to understand what they're meant to do or to get the experience you're trying to create, then you want to look at your level design and say, okay, what can I do to try to bring that experience out? And usually the tools in your toolkit are things like this, right? Things like light. Light is always the answer to being able to draw people's attention to the things that they're meant to see or the things they're meant to do, right? If you're in a forest in your game, you know the path because it's the part of the ground where the grass isn't as thick and it's a little bit lighter in color, right? To indicate that there's a path there. If you're in a dark room and you're trying to figure out where the exit is, it's always the part of the room that looks slightly less dark than the rest of the room. If you're trying to figure out who the main character is in the game, typically it's the one that's brighter than the ones around it, right? Light is always the answer, or always the first thing that you think about when it comes to drawing your attention to things. So that's why in games like, Metal Gear Solid, like you're here, you look around and like the light is the first thing that draws your attention, and the light's down at the bottom. Anywhere where there's a light source, your eyes automatically get drawn to it to try to investigate if there's something interesting going on. So much of that is the idea of contrast, right? It's the idea that the area on the ground that's a lighter green than the rest is probably the path, right? The door that's a slightly different shade of brown than the walls is probably meant to be interacted with. Even things where objects have like a brighter shade, or they are more defined, or they've got like cell shaded borders, anything that helps contrast the thing that's interesting with the things that are not is useful. It's one of the tools in your arsenal to be able to get people to notice what you want them to notice. Camera angle is another one. So like you can see here, right? You know, the main character is typically in the center of a scene, but here it's on the side because the camera wants to highlight the things that are going on the right. Collectible objects. This is like coins in Mario, right? If there's a path that you're meant to go down, there's going to be a little trail of coins going down that path. And partly, even if you didn't collect those things, the fact that that line of coins automatically draws your eyes along that length to be able to see where that trail goes to. And it's typically the way that, you know, games like Nintendo games like to indicate where to go by putting little collectible items on the path that they're hoping you'll see. Sound, yeah, sound is always a good one to be able to indicate like where things are or like when you're going in the right direction. Animations. We'll talk, I can't remember if it's next week or after that. We'll talk about AI and show how like NPCs can be designed to move in a certain way to draw your attention towards the path that leads to your goal, right? And this is one of the tricks that they do is that they'll put like your companion character in a position along the path to the goal so that when you're tempted to look at them, you're also going to see which way that you're supposed to go. And again, avoiding text, right? Assume the players aren't going to read anything, right? So if there's something that you need to convey, look for non-textual indicators to be able to do it. Typically, we get to this point the question of, so which approach is the most effective here? The answer is you do all of them. Not that, you know, all of them are equal. You do all of them, right? You don't just pick one. You make light and you use contrast and you use sound and you put little items. Like the idea of any game is that they don't just rely on one trick. They use all the tricks because there's no goal that's, you know, there's no goal that you want to make non-obvious. Right? You want to make these things as painfully obvious as possible, especially if they're only going to play your game for like 5 or 10 minutes, right? So the more things you can put in, the better. Again, jump in on the chat if there's anything that you want me to clarify on or just, you know, expand on or even like comment on related to your game. But in the meantime, what I'm going to do is keeping in mind some of these principles, right? Different things you can do with light, contrast, camera angle. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a clip from Prince of Persia. This is like the original one, like 2003 or something. Anyway, it's a long time ago. It's very like blocky. But they were pretty good about making certain things pretty obvious, you know, like just really leading you through what it is that you're meant to do. So what I want you to do is while you're watching this clip, I want you to just, you know, type in little things that you can see the game developers were putting in there to tell you what to do. Like what kind of little tricks do they do in order to draw your attention to things or help cue the thing that you're meant to do. All right. So here we go.
Was it real? That magical cavern? If it was a dream, it was a dream we both shared. I knew it.
All right, what's going on? What are they communicating to you right now?
No.
All right, take a little pause. There's a whole bunch of stuff. That's basically 5 seconds worth of gameplay footage. But what are they communicating? Like without having to spell it out for you, what do you know about his situation right now? Yeah, he's missing a sword because he's like, oh, where is it? Where to go, right? And immediately after that, looks over on the ground and sees this necklace, right? What else is he missing? Oh, my jewelry case is missing. Oh, you know. Yep, confused why he woke up, right? Because he's just like, oh, what's going on? Like, where did all my stuff go? But what about the necklace? Yeah, his goal. Because the first thing is that he looks for his sword and he can't find it. But then he looks and he sees the necklace on his own. And then the camera pans out and shows you this, right? So the cue here is that they're basically, like right now, in order to pan out like this, it's to really highlight the fact that he is completely alone in this room, right? Because there's no way of showing loneliness as much as like zooming out and making you look like a tiny speck in a giant cavernous room. And so the fact that they're conveying loneliness paired up with this necklace means that probably he was expecting to find somebody else, but the necklace indicates that they're gone, and the pan out helps to reinforce that fact. All right, let's keep going. So now he's got two goals. I gotta find my sword, and I gotta find, the person who is wearing the necklace. Oh, don't get hit by these people. I don't have my sword. Okay. Does anyone want to say what is it that they were doing here? Oh yeah. Oh look, there's the sword, right? And not only that, but they actually took the camera and they swoop it around, followed the beams of light to be able to show you that there is a light-based puzzle happening in this room. And then went boom, it's like, here's the sword. All right. It's almost painful, but they're trying to say, like, look, there's a light bouncing puzzle going on here that you're going to need to do in order to be able to get the sword, which is right here. All right, let's see what happens. And you can see the light is pretty much interrupting, it's right in the camera view, so that in order to see your main character, you have to look through these beams of light. So it's really drawing out the fact that the light is a prominent part of this level. Right, so they position the camera intentionally so that the light beams get in the way of you being able to see where your character is and what the character's doing. You can see that the plinths that he's moving around, they stand out from the background because the background is pretty fixed, but these plinths have more detail to them. Their textures, have a higher resolution than the floors and the rest of the environment. And light-based puzzles, there's a long-standing tradition of these things. So it's something where you see this and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, I know what these things are. I've seen the light-based puzzle before. All right, gonna get ready to pause this again soon, just as soon as he does this next sequence. All right. Let's focus on the sound, right? They were using, in this tiny little cutscene, they were trying to use sound in order to convey some things. What were they trying to convey in this case? So it was going like swoosh, and then, swung this thing to hit the ground. Let's hear it again. Oh, okay. All right, well, one of the things, so back in the day when I used to be shadowing some of these companies, they would often bring you into the sound room. And the sound room is like, it's what you'd expect, it's a place where they do the recordings of people's voices. But they also have an entire, like a trove of junk. And their whole thing is that they use this junk in order to make the sounds from the game. So like one thing that they were showing me is like, you've got, like if you wanted to make the sound of someone's bones breaking, then they would take a bunch of celery and they would crack it and then record that. There was the idea that they would have different kinds of metal so that you wanted to be able to say, like, one thing is impacting other. You would have bits of stone, bits of metal, and you just, hit them against each other in order to create the sound. So in this case, what they happen is that there's a swooshing sound, but it's also the sound of like heavy metal hitting stone. trying to convey the fact that this sword is like heavy, it's got a certain weight, a certain strength to it. Without knowing what his sword was before, I'm guessing this one's stronger, right? And yeah, so it's fascinating. If you ever get a chance to watch these video clips where they show you like the sound studio of these games, they have like, I've just seen it as like bins upon bins of like just different kinds of junk so that you can make whatever sounds you need to. I always thought the celery one was interesting. Anyway, so he's got a sword. What is he going to do with it? Well, all right, so again, Prince of Persia is a big fan of using the camera to try to indicate the path that the player's meant to take and where they go. Camera, at this point too, is worth noting. Keep in mind, this was also the predecessor to all of the Assassin's Creed games, right? They made Prince of Persia, and then Assassin's Creed came from that using, the same engine in order to be able to do all these kinds of parkour things. But you notice there's a couple of things to notice about the camera here. The obvious one, of course, is that the camera has zoomed out, because fighting scenes, you want to be up close, but not too close, to be able to see the enemies that are meant to be the focus of your vision. But when you're doing parkour, yeah, when you're doing parkour, you're supposed to be able to see the entirety of the space so that you know how you're going to be like flipping off of this thing and then skittering along the wall over here and then doing a jump on a platform over on this side. So the camera zooms out. The other thing I don't know if you've noticed is that the aspect ratio of the camera changed as well. So before it was more like the cinematic, like wider kind of view, but when it comes to this, it switches to more of like the standard 3x4 view in order to be able to give you more of that vertical view so that you can kind of see where you're going. Right. There's a lot, right? There's a lot that's going in here, and it's all in the name of communication. Communicating to you through sound, the strength of the item you just picked up. Communicating to you via camera angle, which way you're supposed to go, or what the most salient aspects of this level happen to be. Communicating through contrast to show that these plinths are more detailed compared to the background, and so they're probably the things you're meant to interact with. Even communicating through like light to be able to say, okay, I need to get through this tunnel to be able to hit that room which looks like it's brighter than the rest. I'll just do a little bit more here. So again, and then camera zooms in some more to be able to highlight the fact that the interactions are more close quarters. And the music starts to intensify in order to go along with the action sequence. And look, there's a really bright light, right? This almost like this, I don't know, this geyser of light coming from the side. And right, and that draws your attention to it, and also I guess it's something you're meant to end towards. Finally, communication. This is something that's relatively unique to this game, is that it would basically tell you when you go onto one of these save points what it is that you're meant to do by leading you through it step by step. All right. So this is just all about designing your level, positioning your camera, doing little enhancements to the elements of your game to try to draw attention to it. And without knowing how your playtest went, I'm guessing that all of you could stand to take these things, which I'm sure you're doing, but just dial it up a little bit more just to help make it really obvious for people who need to figure out your game within like a first few seconds. So that's all just about designing your level and how you're going to put that together. Like we said, there's three things, right? Being able to say, what is a player like? Yeah, what is a player meant to do? What should the player do? And how to reinforce the things that they're doing right. So the second thing of those three is, what is the player meant to do? So in addition to being able to say what the goal is, or what the level's about, you need to be able to say to the player, here's the things that you can do. So again, most people in their games like to start off with a screen that says, here are all the controls you're going to need. That's rough because often they'll see that and they'll kind of absorb it and they'll get in there. And only when they get into the game do those instructions make sense, right? So what do you do, right? And this is where we say, okay, if figuring out what the levels meant or the levels trying to convey, forces us to revisit our level design stuff, this is asking us to revisit our UI UX. Remember when we're trying to find ways of being able to convey information that are better than just throwing up a big instruction screen at the beginning of the game. What else can we do? Well, often what will happen is that we'll have things like tutorial levels that will lead you through each of the player's abilities one at a time, right? So if your controls involve things like jumping, hitting things, or I don't know, like being able to sprint, then you need to have some part of your tutorial where there's a barrier that stops people from going ahead until they demonstrate that they know how your controls work. So for jumping, right, you have some pit where you need to get to the other side, and you've got it very clear that the other side is where you're supposed to go. And if you don't jump, you fall into the pit and you have to climb the ladder back up, right? That kind of thing. It's such a trope now to be able to just say, demonstrate that you understand how jump works by just jumping over this little gap. If it's something like punching or some sort of melee attack, you need to be able to convey it. Like they'll have this thing where it says, oh, there's this dummy that you have to hit, and it actually has a sign that says hit me, and you have to go up to it and punch it a few times, and when it does, then the door will open. That kind of thing. These gateway levels to be able to say that you've demonstrated how the controls work enough that we know you know how to jump, punch, and sprint. Once you're actually in the level, being able to say what you need to do, that comes from other kinds of highlights, right? So when you get to an interactable object, often it'll light up to say, oh, I can interact with this thing. It'll have the little button that you're supposed to push come up on top, right? It says press space to interact. These are more effective ways to be able to convey how to interact with the level than making everyone memorize what their controls are at the beginning. You introduce these things bit by bit as they're needed, because if you introduce it when it's needed, then it motivates why you need this control. Whereas if you look at it at the very beginning, it's like, wow, apparently I'm going to need a power up button, and I'm going to need a sprint button. I don't get it. And then you get into the level and it's like, oh, I need to sprint to be able to get across this portion of water without falling through. That reinforces the need for it at the time that you're introducing the control. Right. So this is the typical way that things happen now. You can still have a pause button bring up all the controls for people who don't remember, but the idea is you don't expect everyone to memorize a sheet like a ledger of various control inputs, before they even have a chance to test the game. What else? Yeah, and then being able to highlight, if I'm meant to jump this portion, then really highlight that on the other side is where I need to go, so that I understand that this is the jumping portion of this level. If I need to use my melee attack, have something that looks like a door, but have it clearly be made of slightly cracked ice, so that you go up to it and the first thought is, well, it's bright and it looks like it could break. I'm going to try breaking it, right? So you always highlight the thing that they're meant to interact with, so that they know the context in which they're meant to use these actions. Okay, let's see some of these things. All right, so the case study here. I'm just going to take a clip from Shadow of the Tomb Raider. This one's going to also have a lot of the level design hints that you saw in Prince of Persia. But what we want you to do is, can you try to also see not only what they did to the level to help draw your attention to key things, but also how they try to emphasize what actions you're meant to perform. All right? All right, let's see.
Jonah, I'm entering a cave. We may lose contact.
Please toss things into the chat that indicate what you see. What do you see here that helps you understand that they're trying to communicate with you?
cave looks like it's usually underwater. Right.
Even things like they put the control highlights over things like, rope pulling. This is the thing you're meant to do rope pulling on in case you've forgotten, right? Little survival hints in the bottom that say what controls you're meant to use. Don't forget that you can push this button to dive, right? Yep, lighting up ahead to indicate that there's a gap that you're meant to head towards. Oh, foreshadowing, right? Putting something in front of your main character to help foreshadow something that's likely going to come up later. Oh. Again, the camera is really close and tight in those cases where you want to feel claustrophobic. And then, zooms out enough for you to be able to look at the light source to figure out which way to go. Oh, look. Where are the shrieking eels? Again, camera, right? Very tight, very claustrophobic, shaky to kind of indicate, the struggle aspect to it. Sound and music. If you're pushing that E button. Oh no, I'm on an Xbox, I don't have an E button. Yep. So little highlights over the
Have to find
pots.
the temple Dominguez is looking for.
Right. Textures on areas that you're meant to climb. Text over them to remind you that you're supposed to do it. And then, the big reveal, right? The main reason why we get you to do this exercise of trying to pay attention to the things that designers do is because we don't typically do that. We're usually playing these games and we're enjoying the experience, and we get so immersed in it that we forget that these things are crafted experiences that have iterated through like probably dozens of different versions in order to arrive at this, the experience that you've got here. Everything from like sound engineers trying to make the sounds like coincide or reinforce what's going on in the action. Cameras that are supposed to follow at a certain distance based on whether you're trying to create sort of like an open field like this, or where you're basically trying to like swivel the camera so that the player's not in the middle because you want this thing that's kind of large and lit, contrasted to the background to be the thing that you draw your player's attention to. Little textual prompts to remind you of the controls because, well, in those cases, you need to put up the letter E to say, press the letter E now in order to get out of here. But also to help remind you, like, what actions do you have in your arsenal that you can use to say, pull down, this barrier that's in the way. Bubbles, things to help reinforce which way is up. Lighting to be able to draw your attention to which way you're going to go. These are things that have been going on, in your games all this time. And maybe you've noticed them, maybe you've reflected on how they designed these levels in order to try to get you, like, to communicate with you and help you understand. But if you haven't been thinking about it, well, now we want you to, right? Now we want you to recognize that games are constantly communicating with you in multiple different ways to try to get you to enjoy this experience that they've crafted for you, right? Anyway, so the idea is that, like, if games are constantly telling you like what to do, where to go, in multiple and like multimodal ways, Then the other aspect, the third thing we were talking about, being able to say what they're meant to do, how they're meant to do it, but also like how well they're doing, giving them feedback is key. So you want to be able, as the players playing this game, to know if they're doing the right thing, right? By reinforcing their behaviors in some way. If they picked up a coin and that was good, then you want to make a little sound, right? Like a happy sound that indicates, yes, you just did a good thing, keep it up. If they're going the right way, then, you can do things like have jaunty music go in that direction. You can do things like, have their score go up, have little sounds be made as long as they stay along the path, right? There's nothing that you say to yourself, oh, that's just too obvious or that's too much. No, there's nothing that's too much in this game, right? Right now, you want it to be too much because you want it to be, you want to be like really coming out and helping the players say like, please go this way, like, please go this way. And so this is where we're supposed to be providing feedback in multiple ways. Boss battles are a really good example of it, because usually the idea is that you go into a boss battle and generally you don't know what you're supposed to do, because what you need to first do is have the boss kill you a few times before you start to recognize certain patterns. And then, based on that, you can see that the patterns of where the boss jumps, where they run to, like how they shoot at you, those are things that you can work around. And so the idea is that the game is trying to make things really hard and trying to kill you a few times first, but at the same time, like giving you little hints to be like, do you see what I did there? Oh, I turned my back on you. Although I wouldn't want you to hit me right now, right? It's basically like playing against, like your older cousin who wants to let you win, but doesn't want you to recognize that they're letting you win, right? They make it hard enough that you always feel like you're about to lose, but they're always doing things like letting you catch them. They're always, like turning their back or like, oh, putting down the wrong card and, letting you win this hand. Like this is the kind of thing that you see in boss battles. So they're always communicating that stuff to you. And then when you do well, then they'll do things like you go into an animation where they've been stricken and they fall down and, you feel like you feel like a god because you just, knocked down this giant behemoth. Or they'll release power-ups, right? Why do they have a bunch of power-ups in their pockets that come raining out when you hit them? Who knows? But the idea is that gives you that feeling of like ka-ching. So yeah, this is a good thing. I'm going to do it some more, right? Even things like, like little sparkles, like little bursts of flame when you manage to impact them. Like there's a ton of little things that help reinforce the good things that you're doing so that the player knows that they should continue doing this if they want to succeed, right? So again, there's no lack of things that you can do to be able to tell your player they're doing the right thing. My favorite example of this. Oh, that's loud. Let's review all the things that they're doing here to tell you you're doing the right thing. You're not an ordinary fella. Is when I'm on the dance floor. That's why I like to hear from people. So let's see. What do we got? We got a bar on the top that's building up until it's going to start flashing like crazy. It starts telling you that you're perfect. It gives you this number that keeps building to tell you what combo you've got. It shows the person dancing in the background to this really like psychedelic background scene with butterflies apparently. It's basically just trying to figure out every possible way that it can tell you you're awesome and just rolls them all out at the same time, right? And I mean, you're barely paying attention to that stuff, right? Because you're trying to just like stare at these arrows to figure out, what do you need to do? But in the periphery of your vision, you're seeing these things and you recognize like, oh, okay, I think I'm doing a good job because every so often I see the word perfect show up and, that's me. So yeah, this is why we say, your feedback, like you can construct a good level, you can make, your character design clear, but always make sure that you are putting things in. Every time your player does something, you give them some indication as to whether it's the right thing or whether they need to pay attention to this other thing over here instead, right? And rewards are always good to be able to indicate, that they've done a good job. Sometimes the rewards are very perfunctory, like, oh, you just gotten like a higher score, right? Okay, that's great. Sometimes they're a little bit more tangible, like here's some health potions, or here's like Here's a mushroom that will make you bigger. And sometimes there are things like weapons, right? I need to pick up ammo for this superpower weapon that I don't get a chance to use very much. Oh, I got rockets for my rocket launcher. Perfect. Or sometimes it's like a new weapon, like, oh, I got to pick up the shotgun, and they always do this thing where it's like, oh, you got the shotgun. And it's like, ooh, cool. All right. All these things are meant to help reinforce that you're doing a good job and to give you incentive to keep going, right? Because people love doing things that they're awesome at. And so putting these things in every so often helps to reinforce people's behavior and encourage them to continue, especially if they feel like there's a promise of something else to come if they continue what they're doing. I don't know. Again, all of you have just finished doing your alphas. You've just had your first play test. Some of the stuff you're like, oh yeah, I've got it. And some of it you're thinking, well, I'm going to do this, but I don't have time right now. I'm too busy trying to put these things in. The idea is that you don't just work on any one thing, like building the next level at the expense of putting in these small things. You always want to be doing both. You want to be adding, to expand your game, but you also want to be taking your game and whatever people have play tested, you want to polish it. So all the things I mentioned right here are things where in preparation for Friday, you probably want to do at least a few of these in order to take the game that they're going to see, the thing that people have play tested already, get rid of all the bugs and find all the things where people weren't clear about what they were meant to do or could have used a little bit more motivation to continue doing, and just use some of these to be able to reinforce that, like bring that experience out more, just to prove to yourself that you can. You don't have to like litter the entire level with little coins or collectibles, but put in enough that, when people do your playtest on Friday, you can see how they deal with certain ideas, like certain collectibles or certain power-ups versus others, and decide which ones you keep and which ones you lose. The idea of multiple playtests is that you have the chance to explore some of these things that you think you just need to leave to the end, but figure out which ones actually work so that you know to kind of base your reward system around them. All right. Anyway, so this is all like the major things. Like if I had to pick 3 major things that you have to work on from your alpha to your beta through your playtest, it's this stuff. Use your playtest to figure out what communication issues need to be done, right? To be able to help people understand how to play your game. Let's assume you figured all that stuff out. Your game is communicating, it's communicating super well. Everyone knows exactly what they're meant to do. What do we do next? Well, that's where you start to figure out how to tune the experience, right? The idea of challenge. And for this, there is scientific literature on this stuff. The main one is from this researcher named Csikszentmihalyi. His main thing was the idea of optimal flow. So optimal flow says that if you were to plot, the amount of difficulty that a player encounters over time, the intuition is that this thing should just increase over time, right? Because you start off and you're a novice, so you don't want it to be too difficult as you're learning the ropes. But then as time progresses, your levels, your game should hopefully also be increasing in difficulty so that you don't get bored. That's the general intuition. That is not actually the most successful way of making your game. Instead of making something where it is linear from time to difficulty, optimal flow states that you should actually have a curve that looks more like this. So this is something where the difficulty ramps up sharply, and then as you master it, it levels off a little bit. So that gives you the sense of, okay, I'm learning how to play this game. I'm learning this new mechanic. And once I master it, then I go into this area where I am just like I am so awesome because I now have this new mechanic and I'm mowing down all these people and look how great I am, right? If this thing is like a continuous slope, it's like trying to climb up a never-ending hill. There's this sense that you'd never slow down, you never get a chance to catch your breath. But here, these little plateaus are meant to have you overcome a particular obstacle or learn some new gameplay mechanism, and then be able to exercise it and feel good about yourself before you engage in the next one. So that's why these things go up in steps. This is also explaining like boss battles. Boss battles are at the top edge of each of these steps. So, you've managed to slog your way through this level, and at the end of it, you beat this boss. And as soon as you do, what happens? then things become easier. Then like you suddenly return back to the village where everyone is friendly and no one's trying to kill you. You suddenly have like a big pool of health potions and treasure that's, this big boss left behind. You got a little cutscene that helps reinforce how amazing you are. All these things happen after you beat the boss, right? So after you have come up to and over the edge of this cliff, then you have a period where you get to explore, a period where you're going to be able to just enjoy this feeling of having beaten the boss, because all the people come out and congratulate you or tell you that you saved them. But that's why this is supposed to be the optimal curve rather than this, right? So the idea is that you're supposed to keep things in this range, right? Like this little region that goes linearly from low to high over time. The idea being that if you were to go above this range, then that's when you start getting like frustration, right? This thing is way too difficult. I'm never playing this Dark Souls game again. Whereas on the other hand, if you were to make something that doesn't increase in challenge fast enough, then boredom. So this is the idea that increasing, like making your game challenging but not too challenging is a difficult process. Just trying to make sure that you are always going along this line instead of going too far on one direction or the other. And some of you again have seen this now in your games. You've put together a level which was too challenging. Sometimes it's just because of communication, which is why you have to solve communication first. If you've done everything and they know exactly what they need to do, but they find that they just can't do it, even with knowing like what the actions are and what you're meant to do, or even what the strategy is, they just physically can't do it. That's when you've kind of moved a little bit too much into this region and you need to dial things back. All right. So that's why we show you this. This is kind of a big thing. And the way you do it, through all these different techniques, typically, you're going to have a game where it's kind of a bit of a trope, like it's a platformer or it's a racing game, or, it's like an endless runner, something where people understand where the balance exists, right? That you need to do these things, you need to get over these obstacles, and you need to try to avoid this, this level that the designer has put in front of you, right? So you can lean into those things a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about adaptive AI later, but not quite yet. So the idea is that you want to be able to add some challenge, and you want that challenge to increase over time so that people feel like they almost didn't make it, but then they managed to pull it out at the end. That's the feeling, right? That juicy kind of feeling that people get when they've overcome something that they felt could have beaten them, right? But in the end they did it. How amazing am I? Like that kind of feeling. So how do you scale these things? So the general advice that we usually say is that you need to actually curate the experience. This means, as much as possible, try to avoid like randomly generating enemies, like randomly generating power-ups, randomly generating potions. You should have this level design such that you want people to start off in a particular place. You want them to encounter certain experiences, and you want to have those experiences come together in a scaffolded way, meaning that the easiest one comes first, and then the slightly difficult one, and each one is trying to push you in a different way. So you would basically be like, this one's a jumping level, this one's like a fighting level, this one's a jumping and fighting level, this one's going to be jumping and fighting with like 2 enemies at once. You want to be able to know that you have scaffolded these experiences to build from what was really easy and introduces just one concept to something that gets progressively harder. And then this always lends itself to the idea of like, what is your first level going to look like? What is your tutorial? Every time someone tries to put together a tutorial, especially in this course, you're new to this stuff. No one ever gets the tutorial right the first time. Just know that, and understand and accept it, because that'll help you forgive yourself more and get past it. Usually when we say, what would the easiest level look like? They'll say, oh, I'm going to have something where they're going to just jump over this one thing, and then they have to hit this other thing, and then they're going to collect this thing and throw it, and then they get through the level. Really easy. And we say, no, easier would be if all they had to do was jump, or all they had to do was one of those things. And people are like, oh, really? Just that? It's like, yes. You want your tutorials to be so laughably easy that you can't possibly imagine that this would be worthwhile. That, they're definitely going to be bored. That is the perfect level to aim for when giving your tutorials. Again, remember, you've been playing this game so much that, these things that seem like, that other people would find, helpful to lead them into, the controls for your game are just going to be so boring for you to play. And we get that, right? Whenever you play test your own game, you're gonna be like, I don't want to have to do this stupid level because it's just so dull. That's good. That's exactly what you need for your intro levels, right? Something which you find completely dull because other people need that to be able to get up to your level. So that's typically how people make tutorials. They'll make a level they think is easy, and then they'll back it up and back it up and back it up until it's basically atomic. Like there's no way of dividing this thing or reducing it anymore. That's basically level 1. All right. So there's the idea of introducing people to things gradually. There's the idea of keeping things balanced so that, if you have a character and let's say you've got like 2 characters that they're both doing about the same thing. So let's say, I don't know, you've got like a game about 2 kids that are stacked on top of each other. You want to be able to make sure that both players are going to have an equal experience. That it's not like one person's just doing the walking and one person is just doing the interaction, and one of those 2 things is like more interesting or desirable than the other, right? So it's all about trying to strike a balance and make sure that, different characters, different approaches, different strategies that you might, that a player might try are all equal. And this is hard, because sometimes you'll make a level and you'll see that this is a way that you expected them to go through it. Like, oh, I don't know, let's say you've got like a pizza guy who's supposed to be delivering stuff. You want them to jump at certain intervals, you want them to go through the path in certain ways, and then you find out that they're taking this other path, they're going this other direction. Rather than trying to stomp that out and make sure they don't do it, you just say, all right, well, if that's what they're interested in, let's see what happens if we were making another path that's equal to the one I had planned, but helps respond to what these players want to do. Because if they want to do it, I should probably respond to it. And the last thing, all of this stuff is connected to playtesting, right? You don't do a thing unless you know that the players want you to do it. So like the example I just said, like if there was a second path that your player wants to go to deliver their pizza, rather than try to tell them, like steer them away from it, you can say, well, okay, why do they want to do this? Well, I guess it's because at this point, the path I want them to go down, requires them to go down to the ground, and it's, they wouldn't necessarily get that. Sometimes players just like to jump up and up and up. Okay, well, you know what? Like, why deny them that? Let's make it so that they can jump up and up and up. And if they miss, they fall down to the path that I was trying to set for them. It's all good, right? If that's what makes them happy, if that creates an interesting experience, then we do it. And so all this stuff is in response to what your players do. If your player sees something and doesn't understand it, then you try to work on your communication to help make that clear, or you decide whether it's not even meant to be there at all. You say, okay, if there's something where they're feeling overpowered, then you want to say, okay, like how am I going to respond to this? And the answer is not always to make things easier. That is actually the opposite of what some people found, is that, so we've had some guests come in and they've talked about this experience, the playtesting experience. And what they found was that when they were putting this game in front of people, that, people said, oh, this thing is too hard. And as soon as they made it easier, then people just dismissed it and they didn't find it fun anymore. So the answer wasn't actually to make the experience easier, but to make it hard and just give the player more power to be able to overcome it. Like they wanted to overcome the hard obstacle. That wasn't what they were complaining about. They just felt like they were underpowered to be able to respond to it. So they gave them more health potions. They gave them like stronger weapons, and then they felt awesome. So playtesting, it's like you got to be able to do this to be able to find out what things need to be fixed. And then you have to be able to listen to what people are saying to be able to know what kind of changes you want to make. And like we talked about before when we talked about playtesting reports, I mean, heat maps, right? Like this is why people use these things, to be able to try to read data and understand where do the issues lie, like where do we need to fix things. And so all the greatest games, like the ones that we showed you, I mean, it might seem like those games just kind of came because someone came up with it, but they take a huge amount of time. And one of the things I find most useful is like the series of quips by Portal. Because again, Portal was supposed to be just an experiment, right? It wasn't meant to be as huge a game. It was just supposed to extend, half-life by using their engine to be able to do something interesting, right? It's not unlike what we do for this course. They came up with a simple, interesting, weird idea of connecting 2 points in space and then just built a game around it. But it wasn't just enough to be able to make that mechanism and then make puzzles around it. There was a lot that they needed to convey.
One of the things we learned from Narbacular Drop, our student project that became Portal, was that players often thought portals took them into other spaces or even other dimensions. To help fight that notion, we start players in a visually unique room with memorable objects, so that when they walk through a portal for the first time, they have a clear point of reference, which communicates the idea that they're still in the same basic location. For instance, the radio, which is playing an instrumental version of Still Alive, helps as well by providing some audio continuity.
All right. Student project. I thought that was cool.
It's absolutely critical that players quickly wrap their heads around what a portal is. We noticed early playtesters grasped the concept much more quickly when they caught a glimpse of themselves through a portal. So we deliberately positioned this first portal to ensure that players will invariably see themselves.
Okay, that was really short. Hold on.
Portal is effectively an extended player training exercise. We spend a huge portion of the game introducing a series of gameplay tools, then layering those tools into increasingly difficult puzzles. This layering starts here, where we train the button and box mechanic before introducing the more complicated concept of portals.
After completing each test. First, however.
So there are, I want to say like dozens of these, and each of them gets at some of the things that we've been talking about here, right? At the very beginning, when people were playtesting, they didn't understand the concept of portals. So we had to create a room that really just drove the idea behind them, to be able to show like, this is what you look like through a portal, and to make everything unique so that you recognize, like when you're looking at this other room, that it is actually the same room that you're in, right? And then what they were saying about taking these gameplay mechanics and introducing them one at a time, so that people can then, like combine these things together to create more complex puzzles. This is exactly what we're talking about here, right? The intro levels of Portal are super simple, but again, the first time you play it, you don't realize it because you're too busy just trying to figure out what is the puzzle here. Oh, there's a box. Oh, there's a button. I get the sense that I'm supposed to put the box on the button, and there's, like, while it seems painfully obvious, with emphasis on the painful, that's only for the people who have already played it. For the people who are playing it for the first time, it's just obvious enough to be able to help them get through and figure out what they need to do. So if you have a chance, you should look at these things, because there's nothing that gets at sort of like how simple games like Portal, which looks almost just so rudimentary that you wouldn't think that there was a lot of design put into it, are actually there because they have gone through rigorous playtesting to be able to figure out what needs to go in it and what doesn't. All right. So, okay, like I said, there were three major things. One was communication, one was challenge, and the third is the aesthetic quality. Once you've managed to make a game, which would be great with just, gray boxing, right? Cubes on cubes, that's when you have to try to bring in the aesthetic elements. And that's part of the reason why we were kind of glad that our campuses started at different times, because in order to make these games work, like, you really need to get the functionality in before you start figuring out the aesthetics. And the reason for that is because your functionality can change, right? Your mechanics might change, the way you're meant to interact with your game might change. And, if you locked yourself into an aesthetic style beforehand, the changes you might need to make might not gel with this aesthetic style that you've committed yourself to, right? If you've locked yourself into making a game that's going to take place underwater, what happens if you realize, oh, the floaty underwater parts don't work? Then it's like you feel like all of these character designs you've made for an underwater scene are going to go to waste unless you were to change something that kind of doesn't make this game as immersive as before. See what I did there? Underwater, immersive? Anyway. So the main thing, again, is that we're trying to create immersion. What is this? People describe this in different ways. You can look at immersion as being the thing where, if you're playing it and then you suddenly stop, you kind of look up and it's like, oh my gosh, when did the sun go down, right? Or you're playing this thing, and even if it's not realistic, you still feel like everything in this world is consistent, that everything fits, and you know how something is going to behave based on the way it looks and the way other objects like this have behaved. So there is that sort of internal cohesion to this thing that allows you to feel like, you have entered into this world and you know how like the physics and the behavior of this world works, such that you can go and interact with it fully. Instead of, when people talk about breaking the immersion, that's when something happens that's inconsistent with your expectations. And I don't mean expectations like, I'm awesome, I should be able to rock this game. I mean expectations like, I expected that this door would allow me to open it because it looks like a door, right? And all the other doors I've opened look like this. Why is this one like just a texture and not an actual door? So this is where you're kind of breaking the immersion, because you created this expectation of how the game is meant to behave, and then you broke it by not fulfilling your end of the bargain, right? It's like this contract. If you're going to be putting a door somewhere, I better be able to open it, because that's what doors do. So that's why it's kind of frustrating. Just like it's equally frustrating when you get to a point where like I somehow, like there's this really thin bush and I somehow can't get through it. Like this is a barrier to me. I'm hewing down demons with my super sharp sword, but I can't get through this bush, right? That's again, breaking the immersion by taking the expectations you have for this level and then not allowing the player to do what they would expect to be able to do, all right? So this is why we say, immersion doesn't have to be the same as realism, all right? Immersion just says, or like having something be immersive, having something be like consistent, means that it can be unrealistic, right? I mean, no one thinks that like a human being could jump several times their own height and somehow collect coins that are the size of their torso, and like have turtles that are walking on their hind legs while anthropomorphic fireballs come up and try to get them. Right? Nothing about this is realistic, but it is consistent, right? If everything behaves in the way that you would expect, you touch a coin, you expect you're going to eat it, or well, collect it, or whatever. You stomp on something's head, unless they've got spikes on their back, you expect that they're going to kind of go poop, and then you dispatch them. There's this idea that even though like you can create a world that is not realistic, but it behaves on a set of rules, and those rules are consistent in a way that allows you to kind of immerse yourself in it and not feel like anything's reminding you that you're playing a game. So this means being consistent. This means giving players freedom to do what they want to do. Again, you can basically put a giant cliff somewhere and say, nope, this is a giant cliff. And people are like, okay, and they understand that that's a barrier and they're not going to be able to get through it. You put an invisible wall, that's a little bit different, right? Again, it's a barrier, but it doesn't indicate why we shouldn't be able to go through this because, it's invisible. Those are the main two things. Other things that can make it immersive are things like customizability. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about character design and how, a lot of characters in games like, Uncharted and Heavy Rain and, Splinter Cell all have the same, grizzled male archetype, as their main character. The idea being that they tried to create a character that, could be as transferable to their core demographic, which, sadly was just young males. But if you allow people to customize things, then you can actually make your character into whatever you want them to be. And of course, when given the freedom, everyone makes the character look like themselves, or at least as close to themselves as possible. Do you remember, I'm guessing most of you were around when the Wii was introduced, and the first time that you got a chance to set up your own Mii character, what did you make it look like, right? Kratos? Probably not. Probably you were trying to create one that as closely as possible resembled yourself, right? And this is the idea of being able to give people the customizable experience that they want, in whatever game they happen to pick. So anyway, where does this all tie back into the aesthetics? The aesthetics say that whatever gameplay you've created, you want your aesthetics to be able to reflect that and complement it, and as much as possible to enhance it. Because once you're able to bring these elements in, then the aesthetics that help to suit the game and the kind of feeling you want to create can help make the difference between a game that's really good and a game that is mechanically the same, but just doesn't have the same widespread appeal. So again, we talked about this early on, right? The idea of Angry Birds versus Crash the Castle. They're the exact same game, but because Angry Birds was trying to lean into the casual aspect of it, and trying to make this thing fun and playful, they went for something that was much brighter, that wasn't about, like realistic, like wood panels and characters, but, relied on things like birds and pigs. And understanding that their audience was largely casual and would respond better to more cartoony, cute kind of aesthetics, help them obtain like a bigger market share and, have people embrace their game more than the other one that's, kind of lost to obscurity. And this is where, again, yeah, you want to be able to talk to, your art team, or if you are the art team right now, then this is you, right? This is the thing where once the game has kind of figured out what it is about, then, that's when the whole thing needs to develop an aesthetic that helps to reflect it. And that's where the challenge is, not to come up with something that you've always wanted to design. Like I've always wanted to make, like this, I don't know, this spooky spider character. I don't care if I'm playing something that's like a casual, like if I'm making like Wordle 2, I'm going to put in like the spider character somehow. Now the challenge here is not the art, it's the design. It's the trying to take the thing that you're augmenting and figure out what kind of art style would complement it and enhance it, bring it out more than what it currently is. And again, for all the music people out there, this is a big deal too, right? And it's gotten to the point where music is now, like it's such a big part of the games that they become celebrated, right? So I don't know how many people have been to one of these concerts. I've been to a few of these. Has anyone been to one of these concerts? I've been to this one a few times. I've been to the Final Fantasy one. I've been to like a Zelda one. They usually take place in, I don't know what it's called now. It used to be the Sony Center, then the Hummingbird Center. The one that's like downtown on Front Street, just a little bit east of downtown. Oh yeah, the Final Fantasy one was cool. What they do is that they've got the music and then they show like the clips on the screen at the front. And they have the orchestra in the front that's playing it. The last one I went to, the guy who organized it, Tommy Tallarico, he actually brought the singer for Pokemon. Like, the original Pokemon, you gotta catch 'em all theme song. He brought him out, and the guy basically just did the Pokemon theme song on stage with the orchestra behind him. So yeah, what they'll do is they'll do like a different assortment of video game music. So every time you see the concert, it's something different. They always start off with this song. I think when I saw it once, yeah, they had a choir singing Baba Yetu, because I think Baba Yetu was actually, I think they won a Grammy, like the first video game music to win a Grammy. Yeah, if anyone was taking 258 with me in the fall, this is familiar. Oh, elevator action. Yeah, and for the type to win, folks, yeah, this was the game I was referring to, Dragon's Lair. Where basically it's just like an animated Disney movie that you keep going with quick time events. And then they had a sequel called Spaces. Okay, last one. Point that I'm trying to make is all this stuff. I mean, it's great to be able to watch these things and relive some of these retro games, but you almost don't notice how the music has become such an integral part of them until someone starts humming the Super Mario theme, right? It's almost evocative of the kinds of games that you play back then, such that if you're creating something and you want to be able to really enhance it, yeah, like the aesthetic aspects of, you know, the visuals are, of course, key, right? It's a video game, right? Video games kind of scream video. But this is why we also want to make sure that you don't neglect the music, right? The people that are in your group, you know, you have music students and their contributions may seem like an afterthought to most people, but they can actually really emphasize things, not only in the sounds that reinforce what you're told to do, but just even in the music that helps to create the mood, right? And so you really need to do this again purposefully, right? It's not as much just being able to compose something. That is a valuable and difficult skill, but even more so to be able to compose something that you know enhances the kind of gameplay you've got and brings out a particular feeling or a particular experience that you're trying to evoke, right? And this is all about, you know, the idea of like stimulating your player by giving them things that help to like grab their attention and, you know, try to heighten the experience for them. Some of it is through like, you know, the visual effects, like making little things that flash, making things that are visually appealing, but also like, yeah, the sounds that help to emphasize, like I've just swung this heavy sword and hit the ground. It makes a nice satisfying thump to it, right? To really bring out, you know, that this is weighty, you know, this is powerful. You've just gotten a great sword, right? All these things, like they're small but valuable. And so because they're small, they're easy to overlook, but we want you to make sure while you're working on these things that you've got a huge team of people that can be split into doing various things. Make sure that everyone is being useful and that they're all doing something, you know, like there are small changes that can have like a big effect. Right? And this is one of those things where, again, there's a whole study that's been done on like death in games, that when your character dies, there's ways that you're meant to handle it. You know, and a lot of games right now, they won't let characters die. They'll just, you know, have them get weak, or, you know, if they're Lego, they'll just break into a bunch of pieces and then recombine somehow. It's not as much about, you know, whether they die or not. It's just making player deaths meaningful. So again, if anyone's playing a game where the player can die because they get hit too many times, you need to make sure that that death is marked in such a way such that the player enjoys it. I'm not saying that they're going to seek it out. I'm just saying that it doesn't just blink and then suddenly you're somewhere else, right? Because that's jarring. It's such an abrupt feeling. It's like, oh, I died. Where am I? I'm at the beginning again. Oh, I guess I must have died, right? That feeling, what you're meant to do is you're meant to put some sort of animation in or something in that helps them recognize, like, oh, there, my character is crumpling to the ground. Oh, I guess I must have died. Maybe I shouldn't have touched that bullet with my face, right? Okay, well, live and learn, right? But they have that moment of reflection before they're then brought back to the beginning and then, given the opportunity to start over. Even if you put something that says, oops, your character died, start over, yes or no, then it gives people a moment to reflect, and it doesn't just trivialize their death. So again, even players dying has to be a communication experience where you try to put something around it. You wrap it in a way that helps them feel like, oh, oops, my character just died. Oh, what a cute little death animation. All right, well, I'm ready to go. At least I know not to do that again. Right? You make it a meaningful experience as much as any other part you're trying to communicate. We'll talk about other things like responsive environment when we go into AI. Believe it or not, responsive environment is an AI area. Anyway, I'll talk about that. But also, again, trying to figure out what is it that you're trying to evoke? What kind of physiological arousal do you want to make? So say you're a game which has, like this bullet hell environment where, they slow down if you get hit. Then yeah, you want to have this sense of what? Like anxiety, the excitement of like navigating through this. You want to create the ability to navigate through it so that you feel awesome for having dodged a bullet, literally. And so you want to be able to create that experience by saying, okay, well, if I want them to be, do I want them to feel excited? Do I want them to feel anxious? Do I want them to be like, scared in the case of some other games? So what do I do to help, really tune that up? Like what kind of things make people scared in games? What kind of things, make you feel like anxious but excited in games? And if we were in person, this is why things like, like VR games, even things that involve peripheral devices are really handy because they get people more active and immersed in the game in that way. Here, we're just going to have to work on creating visuals that help to stimulate people into feeling whatever you want them to feel. Do you want them to feel anxious? Do you want them to feel, like they're, like they're always on the verge of falling down, and like, that feeling of having their senses heightened? Figure out what you want to do. Even if it's something like social, right? You can make something where the whole idea is you're trying to help people. So you put like non-player characters into the game so that even if your gameplay is a little bit quieter, there is something that you're trying to do, like someone you're trying to help, something that you're, some feeling you want to try to evoke, that aha moment of discovering the treasure, right? And the other thing is humor. Other studies have shown that if you want to make like an action game or even like some violent game, humor helps to make it better. And notice this, like anytime you see any kind of action game, or sorry, any action movie, like think about how often, the main character or some like companion character will provide like the humorous notes, right? Or the comic relief. Like next time you watch an action movie, just think about this. Like, where do you see the comic relief? Who's responsible for that? Because what they found is that release, like the laughing, helps to make the other tense parts easier to deal with, and also it helps to reinforce, like the contrast between like the happy moments and the tense ones. This is like when you're eating food, you want to be able to have like some like palate cleanser. Like if you're going to have a bunch of greasy food one after another, having something in between that helps to clean your palate allows you to not feel like it's just the same note throughout your entire meal, but you can actually appreciate each dish on its own because you're kind of you're going into it fresh. Humor, it has the ability to make your game stickier in that, it makes it more compelling, it makes it more fun to play. All right. The last thing to mention is that out of all these other considerations that we're talking about, probably the biggest one is time. You can't afford to do everything, right? You know this. You only have like, from today, some of you have 2 weeks until your next presentation where you're supposed to show what all the playtesting has led to. And so, there's a number of different things that you could choose, but you'd have to be selective. So if you had all the time in the world, yeah, you can make a great game. But one of the things we always say in this course is games are never released, or sorry, games are never completed. They're just released, right? So you have to consider the amount of time you have and what kind of changes are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. And if you're not sure, then, put in a couple of them into your next playtest and then see, right? But this is the idea that, you have time right now to still prototype a few ideas, but once you do your next demo, we're going to say any features that haven't been put in your game are not going into it. That all you can do is take the features you got and make sure that they are polished. So this is the time to prototype some ideas. If you're thinking about doing something but aren't sure if it's going to work, do it now. Put it in front of people at the Ubisoft playtest, get their opinions. Maybe they'll come up with an idea that you hadn't thought of that'll work even better, right? But overall, beware this idea of feature creep. Try to know that in 2 weeks' time, you have to have your game fairly complete. So what can we reasonably expect to do in the time we've got? How do we make sure that I've got enough to be able to put into our playtesting to be able to get feedback on it to help polish it? This is all stuff you've got to plan in order to be able to do any of the things we've talked about here today. So this is, again, where we think back to what we've talked about in project management, what Bryn was talking about, having a project and figuring out how to stage the development to be able to meet your deadlines and have backup plans in case something doesn't come together the way you expect. Or if it comes together really well, that you've got some buffer to be able to invest a little bit more into it to just enhance it. So often I'll do some sort of case study on a particular game to be able to say, okay, how does this game do these things? How does it communicate with players? But rather than do that, I think there's one other game that I would like to draw attention to. So I could talk about Fortnite, but I would prefer to talk about this one. Air Miles. How is this a game? Right? Now, have you thought about this? This Air Miles is a game. But let's think about it, right? How does it communicate what it is that you're meant to do? How does it communicate, the rules of the game? Well, when you purchase these things, it makes it pretty clear. People will ask you, do you have an Air Miles card? Right? And so the rules are pretty much yes, I do. Well, will you scan it? And then how does it tell you that you're doing a good job? How does it give you feedback? You get points, right? And you can see your points build up. And then that leads itself into certain rewards. You may not get power-ups or health potions, but you can use your points to be able to, say, buy tickets. Or if you're not building up that fast, you can buy experiences. Or if you're not building that fast, you can get a toaster. But the idea is that you have a certain incentive to be able to keep building up these points in order to be able to reap the rewards a little bit later. And so you're incentivized. And then in terms of your players' behavior, if you think about how your game is trying to get them to do certain things in order to solve your level, what is it that Air Miles is getting you to do? What player behavior is it getting you to do that you wouldn't have done normally? How are you playing the game? It's not as much just about collecting things, but it'll change people's behavior by having them actively go to places where they accept or they can scan in Air Miles, if only just so that they can build up some more of these points, right? So people play the game by changing their behavior and navigating to places that allow them to collect Air Mile points. Yeah, so, and you might think, well, that's not much of a game, but the response to that is, it doesn't have to be much of a game if you have millions and millions of people playing it. When I was at EA, they were saying, out of all of the sports games that they have, which one makes the most money? And it's not necessarily which one is the best game. That wasn't what they were asking. They were saying which one makes the most money. And they said that it's FIFA. And not because FIFA is necessarily the best title out of all their sports games. It's not, but you don't need to be. There's so many people who are soccer enthusiasts, well more than, say, hockey, that even if you get a smaller percentage of soccer fans to buy your game, that still gets you a large number of players, a large number of copies sold. They said in the US, Madden is their top seller. In Canada, it's NHL. But again, population wise, even if every Canadian buys an NHL game, it's still not going to equal the sales they make from FIFA. Air Miles has such widespread adoption that it doesn't matter if the game is particularly good, as long as it's enough that, its base is so wide that, they make a huge amount off of people playing this game. Anyway, that's just the food for thought that I want to leave you with. What's the takeaway from all this? You've just been, I guess, as I said, you've just done your first playtest. You're getting some feedback. This is all meant to make you think about what are you going to do with that feedback? What are the things that you could change? Is there some way that I can make sure my game is communicating better? Once I've managed to get all those out of the way, is there some way I can kind of increase the challenge of it so that people feel like they're excited to keep playing? Once I've gone through that, how do I fix up the aesthetics, both visuals and sound, in order to be able to enhance the experience I'm looking to create? It's all at this point just trying to figure out what the strategy is for your team in response to the feedback you're getting to try to make the best game possible for in 2 weeks' time, right? What are you going to do? We talked about how you structure a playtest, but this is all talking about what you do in response to the feedback you're getting, right? And how do you then fix things up in preparation for the next wave of feedback? Okay, that's the main thing I want to convey. Make sure, if you haven't already, that you're setting up some feedback sessions for next week. Get your friends, get complete strangers, whatever. Get some people who are going to play your game so that after the Ubisoft playtest is done, you have one more round of fixing things up in front of complete strangers. People who are not necessarily in a game design club or a game design company, but just people. And make sure that you get that playtest set up for next week so that you come into your next presentation having polished your game as much as you could in the 3-week time that you had. What else? I guess we'll talk a little bit in our next class about prototyping and kind of how that works, what the process that people in industry use when they're doing this. And yeah, and then Friday is going to be your Ubisoft playtest. So that should be exciting. We're happy to be able to get the Ubisoft ambassadors to give feedback to your games, because assuming that you've used yesterday to help get rid of some of the bugs and the basic playtest issues, hopefully Friday is going to be a rewarding experience. All right, that's it for me. I'm going to stop recording. I hope all of you have a good day. If you stick around, I'll answer some questions about your games if you have any. Otherwise, we'll see you all on Thursday.